And hello and welcome. My name is Martin, and today what we're going to do is we're going to take the idea of a moving pawn to the next step. We're going to create a pawn that can actually sense us, and there's actually two senses that are available inside of Unreal that are already there. The first one is going to be on pawn C, so when we see something, and the other one is going to be hearing. So the character or the enemies can actually hear you, so they don't need to actually be able to see you to be able to hear you to be able to pick you up. And then that would be also, obviously, you'd have to be generating noise, footsteps, things like that. The other thing would be the sight. So you would set up a area that the enemy could see in, and then if your character walked in front of that area, the enemy character would then come in, would do whatever it's supposed to do, whatever it's been programmed. Okay, so let's go ahead and start building this character. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into all the way to the root directory of my content folder. I'm going to go to my a_enemies folder. I have two of them. I'm just going to create this one since it's clean and there's no other stuff in there. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to need to create a blueprint class. And inside that blueprint class, we are going to continue with pawns. So I'm going to create a pawn. Now with this pawn, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call this statue. statue_enemy. Okay. And basically, this pawn is going, and the reason why I'm calling it statue enemy, because statues don't have legs, they don't move. You would expect them to sort of move more or less the way the homing missile did across the floor. So we're not going to be changing the movement, we're just going to be changing the way it interacts with us. So instead of using, and we still need a navigation mesh, and we're still going to need nav mesh invokers and floating pawn movement, but we don't have to program in the movement, or at least not before we had to set up a range, right? And that range is what helped us figure out what we wanted to do with the homing missile and where it was going to attack, and that sort of set up the zones for us, right? In this case, we don't even need to set up zones, because what's going to happen is that zone is going to be in front of the statue enemy in the form of the pawn sensing. So let's go ahead and set that up. So I'm going to double click and open up my state, or my statue. Sorry, it's kind of far away. So statue enemy. Once that's open, I see that I have pretty much nothing in the viewport. I don't have any information in the event graph, so we're going to have to build all of this. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is, obviously, we need to have some type of a mesh, the statue itself, or whatever object we're going to associate with what's going to be chasing us. So I'm going to go add component, and I need to add a static. You can add it in as a static mesh. Inside that static mesh, if we have that selected, we can come over here to the actual mesh, and right now we don't have anything in there. I'm going to type in the word statue, and it does look like there are a few statues that are in there, so let me select one and see what this ends up looking like. Oh, that's pretty crazy looking. I actually like to save this guy for later, because I like to use this thing as a thing to shoot fireballs out of or something. So let's pick a different one. Okay, that would be kind of weird. You know what? We're gonna go with it, because it really doesn't matter what the static mesh is. All that matters is that it works. Okay, so that that it does have a static mesh. So okay, so the static mesh is there. I don't really like that.
An ice statue. Okay. That looks interesting. Fire Grim statue. Hopefully it doesn't come out all weird. Some of these have been sort of weird. This thing's only one-sided, so that would be weird. So let's not go with that one.
Okay, so we're going to end up going with this one. This one, because it has a front and a back, the whole thing's there. We can walk around it, and we would have something that we can interact with. Okay, so now we have the mesh. The next thing that we're going to need is to give this thing some type of movement. So what we're going to do is add a floating pawn movement, right? So we're going to make this thing move more or less the way the missiles did. So we'll add a floating pawn movement. The next thing that we need is the navigation invoker, right? So let's go ahead and type in that. Okay, so we have the navigation invoker. And the last thing that we're going to need is what's called pawn sensing. So if we click in here and we scroll down, I believe it is in sensing. So let's scroll all the way down until we get to the S's. Might be in pawn also. Okay, we'll just type in pawn. And so there is a pawn noise emitter, there is pawn sensing, and then there's the other pawn. So we're going to go with pawn sensing. Okay, so if we select pawn sensing, right now we're not going to see anything. Normally we would see sort of like these rays sort of pointing out from the middle of where the pawn sensing has been attached to our unit. Right now we're not seeing that because we have not compiled. So once we compile, we will then be able to see the information about the pawn sensing. Now, right off the bat, it looks like this thing is 90 degrees off axis. So what we're looking at here is a couple of concentric rings. We see this really big green ring. We also see sort of like a yellow sphere, then a smaller blue sphere, right? So if we were to select each one of these, or actually if we go into pawn sensing, I should say, and we scroll down until we see, where is it? Sight radius. And let's see if it gives me on C-pawn, enable, yes. Where is the... So that's going to make it longer. This one's going to make the threshold of hearing. So this is when it starts to hear something, and this is when it can actually hear you, right? So the yellow sphere is going to be, kind of like, oh, I feel like I heard something, kind of maybe over there in that direction. The blue one will be like, nope, it's definitely coming from there. And then the green one is going to be the sight. So normally what I do is I don't really use the hearing one too much. So what I'll do is I'll actually bring that one and this one all the way down to just around the character. So then that way I don't see them quite as much. And then the other thing I need to do is change the angle that this thing is at. So let's go ahead and compile one more time. Oh, there's the angle. Okay, so now we can see that we have built that cone going in front of us. It's always going to point in the direction of the front. So basically, if you, I know it feels like this should be 180 degrees, but they consider it 90 degrees of vision. Maybe from the center off to the left would be 90 degrees, and then from the center to the right would be another 90 degrees. If you go 180 degrees, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't get any bigger. Even if you go 95 degrees, it doesn't get any bigger. So 90 would be the biggest one. 89, you would start to feel it get like it starts to feel like it's starting to shrink in. So it just depends on what you're going for. If this thing, like a horse who has its eyes on the side of its head, would probably be more like this, right? Like you would be able to see 180 degrees vision. As far as people, obviously I have vision out to 180 degrees, but really what's in focus for me is generally about 45 degrees in front of me. So everything that would be focused in front of me would be about 45 degrees. Oops, where are we going? Okay. All right, so from there, we'll see that this is actually to the side of my character, right? So my character is like looking out of the left side of them, I guess, the right side of them. So what we need to do now is rotate our character. So then that way the character is facing the direction that we need. So we hit compile, save, go back to pawn sensing, and then the character is sensing in front of them, right? Now the other thing we could also do is possibly move this down a little bit. So then that way the pawn sensing shows up more in front. So let me do that a little bit more. So I'm just literally dragging it down. And so then that way the pawn sensing moved from like the base of the character to the middle, because you can't change the actual point. This is always going to come from the center of the ball, right? So if I make the static mesh not visible, at this point, you know, you would just see the center default ball, which is in the middle. So what you can do is move the character down or move the pawn that is the mesh down. So then that way that moves the location of where it's looking in front of you. So anyways, so now we have an area that's quite big that actually extends quite far from the center. I believe the sight radius would be right here. So if I don't want it to see very far in front of it, I can move that down and make it very small. If I wanted to see very far out, like maybe this is a character that is sort of like a sniper or something like that, you might give it a much bigger range, right? Okay, so let's bring the range down to something, not the hearing range, the sight range. So let's bring that down to, let's say 500. Ooh, well, not 50. Let's say 500. Let's say 1000. Okay. So that's something more or less in front of the character. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and hit compile and save. And the only other thing that we could talk about would be the floating pawn movement. This is a statue. It's heavy. It probably is not going to move very fast or accelerate very fast. So let's say we give this... I'm probably going to come back to 300. But let me just go check. Now, there is a way to check to see, because, you know, for instance, if you're being chased, there is a way to make it to where the thing that's chasing you or the enemy that's chasing you is the same speed as your character. So what you need to do is know what speed your first-person character is going at. So then that way we can determine whether we actually have an enemy character that's going to move faster or slower than us on the chase. For us, we can scroll down and we see that we have character movement. So if we select character movement, now I'm in the first person BP, and we can see here that my mass is 100, my gravity is that, my acceleration is this. There it is. My max walk speed is 600. Okay, so that's the fastest that my character, my first person character can go, is 600. So if I have a statue and the statue is going at 300, I can walk twice as fast as the statue can. So at this point, I should be able to outrun the statue. So again, that was in floating pawn movement. We scrolled until we found the max speed. Maybe acceleration, I'll do that to half of it. And let's say compile and save. All right. So now we should be able to take one of those enemy characters, one of the enemy statues, place them out on the floor. Oops. Keep grabbing the wrong thing. Okay, and all I did was just place that down on the floor. Let me slow down my camera so I'm not zipping around too fast. It's a little too slow. Okay. Now, the other thing that we obviously did not do is we do have this really, really giant nav mesh invoker that is sitting around our character. We probably don't need one that big in the fact that obviously it doesn't need to be any bigger than the navigation area that's in front of it. So let's go back to our enemy character and or a statue enemy, and let's go to the nav mesh invoker, and instead of that 3000, let's try 500. Compile and save, and we'd probably have to rebuild the nav mesh, so I'm just going to grab another one and place it out on the floor. And we see now that we have a much more realistic navigational mesh that's set up around the character. And remember that the reason why we're doing this is because in the example that I'm working in right now, I am still working with the Invoker. If you don't have an Invoker, then you'll have to make sure that you put this statue inside of a navigational mesh. Otherwise, this is not going to work, right? So sort of what we did with the first round on the homing missiles before we added invokers. So we're just adding the next step, right? Where instead of this thing having to listen to an AI, it's now listening to its own sight, and it's going to use that to move towards us. Now, having all that done, we're still not done yet because we have not given it the AI move information in its event graph, in its blueprint. So we actually have to, just like we did with the other one, with the homing missile, we are going to have to now get this to react to the on-pawn sensing. So what we need to do now is right-click and type in on C pawn. And if you're not seeing what you're looking for, click on context, and that will usually show you a lot of additional choices that may or may not have actually been there. And we're actually looking for an event. So, and I'm not seeing it. Let's just say C pawn. You know what? Let me just compile this real quick. Save. This better be here. You might have to have pawn selected. Let's try that. Okay. So that's why I wasn't finding it. So the reason why I wasn't finding it was because I did not have pawn sensing selected. So if I select pawn sensing and then come into the blueprint, I will have a couple of different options that I didn't have before. And what we're looking for is the event dispatcher on pawn C. And then this way, this event is actually tied back to this pawn seeing information. So we're going to select that, and that gives us our first bubble, which is the event. Right, so we know it's an event because it's got that little triangle there in the corner, and we have now on C. So now when the pawn sees this, what do we do, right? Normally this would go to an AI move 2, but we actually have to cast this to the first person character, because remember in the last example where we had the homing missiles, we had to tell it that we needed to get the world location, get world location for the first person player, first person character, and that's what allowed us to know what we were supposed to react to. In this one, we're doing the same thing, but we don't have that option here. So what we need to do is we need to cast to first person character. So I'm going to click off of the execute and type in cast to first person character. There it is right there. Now, basically what this is doing is it's saying that when we see the pawn, the pawn that we want to see is the first person character, right? And this is what we're sensing for, is for the first person character. So we've attached pawn to object, so we know what pawn it's sensing. And then from here, what we need to do is attach the AI move to. So we're going to type in AI move to, and this is the same task that we used last time. So this should not look different. What we do need to attach is the target. So the target is going to be the first person character. So this way it knows what this knows what to move towards, right? So now our statue knows what its target direction is going to be, and we need to now tell it what needs to move. And all we have to do here is we could grab self and drag it, click and drag that onto the maybe we can't do self. Okay, we'll just click off of self, off of the pawn, and type in self and get this variable that's called get a reference to self. And if we were to pull that out, we would see now that it just says self, right? So let's go back and read what we've actually done. I'm just going to put this a little bit closer together. Okay, and let me close this a little bit. All right, so now we see that we have on pawn C, pawn sensing, which remember was right-clicking on this, or clicking on pawn sensing, and then right-clicking here to get the add event, event dispatcher, event pawn C, right? From there we clicked and drug out of the execute, and that gave us cast to first person character. And then from there again we clicked and dragged out to add the AI move to. AI move to needed to have the actor or the target actor as the first person character, and the object that's going to move is going to be the pawn. From there we could say stop on overlap, which would stop the pawn from moving. And then from there we could say an acceptance radius of like how close do we want it to get to our character before it actually stops. So if you wanted to stop this, let's say a radius of 100 units before it got to your character, you could. If you wanted this to stop on an overlap, so as soon as this pawn and my character overlap, that's when it stops, to make sure that it doesn't like actually go into me. All right, so that's the code that we need. So let's go ahead and hit compile and save. And let me check and see where I am. My first person character is way over there. All right, let me turn them around real quick. And let's push play. So theoretically, this thing should not move towards me until I am right in front of it. And so that means I can walk up to the side of it, no movement. I can walk into the back of it. I can bump into it, no movement. As soon as I move in front of it, notice that's when it starts moving towards me. Now it sank into the floor because of... Now let's see if I can get it to stop chasing me. There we go. Nice. All right. So the sinking into the floor is actually because of what we did here with this. So if we go back to pawn sensing and let's say move the character back up. Bet you I could just put 0, 0, 0 here. So now it would be back on the floor, and we do want this to be at 90 degrees. So that way it looks like it's always moving forward. So we'll hit compile and save. And let's do this one more time. Okay, so this time it looks like it's floating. and it's floating because of where I placed it. So let's hit end. So it's on the floor. We'll push play. And again, should be able to move, walk right up to it, nothing happens. It will chase me. If I walk far enough away, it'll stop chasing me. Now, some of y'all might notice that it is actually turning in my direction, which is actually pretty cool. And what I did to do that, if we go back to the original code, was... Anyways, I feel like it's in the floating pawn. It would have said use the yaw. And that yaw is what's allowing me to turn. Or not me, what's allowing the statue to turn. Sorry, I'm just trying to find where it was. Okay, maybe it's... There it is, underneath pawn. So it must have been underneath self. Yeah, it's underneath self. So right there, there is use controller rotation yaw. And if you click on that, that'll actually make the statue turn. So that when you're attacking it, or when it's attacking you, I should say, when it's following you, it'll actually look like it's turning, and so we'll keep better able to track you. And there we go. So now we have our moving enemy. And our statue moving enemy using pawn sensing. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed the video and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.